Welcome to the fourth webinar in the Performing Water project. This one is entitled Depths, as we continue our exploration into the thinking with water. We are recording the session, as I just mentioned, so please be aware of that. We're delighted to be welcoming James Linton with us from the University of Limoges, as well as Rupert Glasgow, independent researcher and currently visiting professor here at Le Mans University, both of whom we will be properly introducing very shortly. A special welcome as well to all the students joining us as part of a joint seminar program between Le Mans University and Bard College Berlin in collaboration with our colleague and project partner, Dr. Ramona Moss. For those of you who are not yet familiar with the format, we'll introduce each speaker in turn and give them about 15 minutes or so to talk. And then they are going to engage in a conversation with each other before opening the floor to questions from the audience. So as always, if you have questions, you can go ahead and enter them into the chat at any point, and a moderator will then give you the opportunity at the end to either turn on your mic and your video and ask your question yourself, or she will ask the question for you. You can also use, of course, the raised hand function if you prefer. But otherwise, please try to keep your microphones off just to avoid noise distraction while other people are speaking. Okay, well, it is my great pleasure to begin by introducing our first speaker. So Dr. Rupert Glasgow is an independent scholar born in Sheffield and currently based in Zaragoza, Spain. After an undergraduate in philosophy from Oxford University, he published 3 volumes on comedy and philosophy, which is how I came to know him. So his significant contributions to this provocative topic, 3 books, so Madness, Masks, and Laughter was published in 1995. Split Down the Sides on the Subject of Laughter was published in 1997, and The Comedy of Mind, Philosophers Stoned, or The Pursuit of Wisdom in 1999. These books were of inestimable benefit to me as I was writing my own dissertation, and Rupert was very generous in responding to the eager fan emails of a overly earnest researcher. Dr. Moss and I invited Dr. Glasgow to speak at a symposium that we co-organized in Berlin back in 1914 to talk about his work on comedy. And at the end of that event, he said, "I'm going to send you my latest book, which I wrote on the concept of water." And a few weeks later, I, sure enough, opened my mail book to find, oh, you can't see it, Concept of Water, which is too blue from my background to show up. And, you know, at the time, I didn't really think that my engagement with thinking about water would extend beyond reading his book, but reading Rupert Glasgow can be very tricky and take you places you never intended to go. So a special personal thank you to you from me for that. Dr. Glasgow obtained his PhD from Würzburg University and is working on another and final, according to him, triptych, and this time on selfhood, The Minimal Self, published in 2017, and Minimal Selfhood and the Origins of Consciousness, published in 2018. He writes fast. And the forthcoming and final volume on forms of collective selfhood. Incidentally, he also co-wrote the script for the much-viewed Origins of Consciousness clip, which is part of the In a Nutshell, or in French, Tout Simplement video series, which we will be pasting into the chat for you to enjoy. And there is a link to a free PDF of his latest book also at the end of that clip. And Rupert is currently visiting professor here with us in Le Mans. So I will now turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Anna. That's very kind of you. I'm really happy to be here, and so really honored to be here. And yeah, so I'll just give a little sort of 10-15 minute introduction to the book on the concept of water, and then it'll go over to Jamie. So my aim in writing the book was, amongst other things, to reawaken a sense of wonder and awe in our relationship to water. I wanted to have fun trying to capture the elusiveness of water. From the start, I was aware of the paradoxical or self-defeating nature of such an enterprise, in that any theoretical approach to water does represent a sort of shackling or canalization of water, and thus tends to be leaky. So I tried to contain water within 4 broad concepts. Its relationships to origins, its relationships to flow and process, its relationships to depth and depth and the unfathomable and the unknowable, and the converse relationship to life, purity, and medicine. So I started the section on water as an origin by looking at water as the origin of philosophy, specifically the idea of Thales that everything is ultimately made of water. Actually, not a bad idea given what was known at the time. Variations on the theme were still found in much later thinkers such as Paracelsus, Robert Boyle, and Isaac Newton. The nice thing about writing this was that Thales is as nebulous a figure as water, a sort of mess of contradictions. So I was able to link up 2 strands of what is said about Thales. Not only did he make this claim about water as a substrate, but he's also renowned for having fallen into a well and been laughed at by a Thracian maid. Of course, Thales was not the ultimate origin of such ideas about water. Thousands of years before Thales, myths of creation also point to water as an origin, a primordial matrix from which everything else is derived. Some of the best known such myths are those of Sumer and Mesopotamia. Water here again has a double role, symbolizing both the original formlessness of chaos and the fertility or potential that allows those original waters to be channeled and contained, in practice used for irrigation and agriculture, indeed for civilization itself, whatever that is. So this duality of water is fundamental. It has the capacity to be both the container, the matrix, and the contained, the contents. Perhaps the deepest manifestation of this containment of water is life itself. Water is intimately associated with the origin of life, both in mythology and more recently in scientific discourse. If orthodox evolutionary theory is to be believed, we humans have watery origins and are descended from fish that bravely ventured onto land a few 100 million years ago. Ultimately, in fact, we descended from unicellular aquatic microorganisms. We also have our ontogenetic origins in water, the amniotic waters that nurture us before birth. Life itself is water-based. This may seem obvious, it is obvious, but the emergence of humans on this planet is a result of some amazing features of water, which is inherently weird. By extension, civilization itself is water-based. Even the very earliest civilizations tended to be adjacent to and reliant on rivers. Here too, the duplicity of water is crucial. Water provides the basis for society, but also harbors the potential to destroy it. Our schizoid civilization has been prone to define itself in opposition to water as something to be mastered, shackled or domesticated, drained, rectified or damned, like mind trying to tame an unruly body. But water's waywardness condemns this urge for mastery to failure. The section on water as flow starts with a brief examination of the age-old fire-water dichotomy and the association of water with the feminine, maternal, passive, bodily, low side of reality, as well as the moon, inconstancy, flow, Mercury. Fire accordingly goes with the masculine, paternal, active, spiritual, elevated half of the equation, as well as the sun and sulfur. In fact, of course, this dichotomy is found to be anything but watertight, on the contrary. So I turn to the protean shape-shifting nature of water, as embodied both in mythological figures and water deities, and in its practical manifestations in our life. Water is the only substance to occur in all three states of matter, solid, liquid, and gas, within the range of ordinary temperatures on Earth. It is always leaking, dripping, circulating, as well as shifting, shaping, and sculpting other substances. What's more, its status as a near universal solvent, the fact that so many substances dissolve in it, gives it an unparalleled capacity for self-transformation. This is reflected in the color names given to rivers: the Yellow River in China, the Rio Negro in South America, the Colorado in the States, the Llobregat near Barcelona, and loads of red rivers. Water is thus closely associated with freedom, even lawlessness, whence our need to shackle it, to dam or rectify rivers, to contain them. In this context, I also look at the association of water with reflection, meditation, and wisdom. Water is the archetypal mirror, and in this sense, it reflects us, those who look at it. The myth of Narcissus, who falls in love with his own reflection, warns us against self-absorption and self-love, but hints too at the necessarily flawed nature of self-knowledge and knowledge in general. We are all Narcissus, water looking at water, but also water split from water. I look at how water has been linked with the flow of time, the flow of selfhood, the flow of consciousness, but also how its dark unknowability may represent our unconscious. The section on water as embodying death and the unfathomable starts with the myth of the deluge as it appears, for example, in the flood myths of Sumer, Mesopotamia, Greece, and the Old Testament. It looks at some of the real-life floods that have wreaked such havoc. Flooding of the Yellow River as recently as 1887 is thought to have killed 6 million people. Yet flooding may be a boon as well as a bane, and as exemplified by the relatively dam-free Mekong in Southeast Asia, which periodically causes its tributary, the Tonle Sap, to reverse its flow and run uphill. Tellingly, Egyptian mythology also did without a great flood, instead incorporating a benevolence, a god of fertility and abundance, Hapi, to preside over the annual flooding. The threat of the flood is the threat of a return to the formless primeval chaos from which we emerged. The oceans provide a more constant reminder of this all-encompassing vastness. Oceans are associated on the one hand with conceptions of the sublime, thinkers such as Kant and Schopenhauer. We are nothing compared to the oceans, and yet we in a sense contain them. Yet the deep also emerges as a metaphor for a sort of collective or planetary unconscious, as revealed both in our monumental ignorance of it and the indifference with which we have tended to treat it. One time-honored response to our ignorance of the deep has been to populate it with beasts of myth and fantasy of our own creation. Monsters such as Leviathan, the sea monster of the Old Testament, symbolize the immeasurability of the depths and our fear of being engulfed. Once again, water reflects our own anxieties and imaginings. In our ignorance, we have tended to demonize the sea animals that we have encountered, the whales and sharks and squids and the spectacularly ugly denizens of the deep. I'm thinking in particular of the anglerfish, which are worth checking out. But this raises the question, what makes a monster a monster? Is it a matter of size, a capacity for causing damage and death, or a transgression of ontological, conceptual, or aesthetic categories, sheer ugliness? The only conclusion that can be that the real monster is the bipedal terrestrial with an oversized brain that has systematically massacred so many other usually peaceful sea creatures. The final section of the book looks at how water's literal or metaphorical purity has tended to reflect our yearnings for a solution to our own or the world's ills. I look at the timeless use of water as a dumping ground for human waste and the ambiguous role of water in sanitation. I look at the rise of bottled water and its commodification as a means to a profit. I look at how the cleansing capacity of water also comes to light in numerous religions and in rituals such as baptism and other forms of immersion, embodying a power of resurrection, a new life, and a dissolution of the past. In the spiritual context, there is often a close association with special forms of water, such as wine and beer, and there's a recurrent link between water and inebriation, both religious and secular. Historically, indeed, both beer and wine acquired particular value as kinds of purified water, providing humankind with a drink that was safer than many natural water sources. The link between water and spirits is still in evidence in what are known as aqua vitae or eau de vie. The word whiskey means water of life. Vodka is a little water. Spanish aguardiente is water that burns. The gullet, presumably. At the same time, water's powers of intoxication come to light not only when we swallow it, but when it swallows us. Ask water romantics such as Shelley, Swinburne, Byron, Poe, Goethe, or Valéry, or scuba divers, or free divers for that matter. I end the book with a look at the role of water in medicine and pseudo-medicine, its veneration as an elixir of life, the real or putative benefits of therapeutic bathing, thalassotherapy, hydrotherapy, homeopathy, Bach flower essences, radium water, magnetic water, and even the original Coca-Cola, which started life as a medicinal soda water with a few fancy ingredients thrown in. The conclusion comes back to the protean nature of water as something that defies easy categories of life or death, high or low, good or bad. Water's negativity brings it close, if not all the way to mystical divinity, but may also be associated with trickery, untrustworthiness, and radical ambiguity. Our thinking and theorizing may try to contain water, but to be open to the wonder of water is to recognize and rejoice in our own inherent wateriness, which brings its leaks and limitations, but connects us with every other living being and with the living planet as a whole. And so with that, I hand it back to you. That's me done.
Thank you very much, Rupert. Okay, and Laura is going to now introduce our next guest.
Yes. Right. Can you hear me now? Yes. Great. So it's our great pleasure to welcome Dr. Jamie Linton, who is currently the director of an important research program of water management called Chaire Capital Environnementale et Gestion Durable des Cours d'eau at the University of Limoges. Am I not mistaken, Jamie? You confirm? Great. Jamie first trained in political philosophy and international development studies before turning to geography. His main research interest lies with the relations between water and people from a historical and geographical perspective. Author of many articles and books, including What is Water? I hope you can see the book. The History of a Modern Abstraction in 2010. He's currently involved in personal and collaborative research projects focusing on various aspects of the hydrosocial cycle, public participation in river management, the history of social fluvial relations in France, the political implications of rethinking the materiality of water, and the ontological foundations of the European Water Framework Directive. Today, Jamie will engage in a conversation with Rupert on the materiality and situatedness of water and on thinking with water. So welcome to you, Jamie.
Thanks very much, Laura, for that intro. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, that's working. Great. Well, first, thanks to Anna, Laura, and colleagues for for organizing this interesting event, giving us the chance to think about a really interesting question, and personally giving me the chance, the opportunity to meet Rupert and discover his amazing book and his remarkable work, which I find personally really helpful and fascinating. So I'm a social scientist by training. I'm not a philosopher, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about water, writing about water and studying it. And I find that you can't, it's been, for me anyway, it's difficult to have gone for all these years thinking about water without it seeping in to the way I think and eventually influencing my thought processes such that I'm beginning more and more to think with water. I think that's, I was thinking it would be interesting to put together a collection of articles by people who spend a lot of time working with water, how it affects their thinking, you know, because I presume that it's the case for most of us who spend a lot of time dealing with water, that eventually begins to affect the way that we think. So I thought rather than I'd give sort of an hydrobiographical introduction to my the way that I've approached water over the years. And I guess the gist of what I have to say is that my approach to water has changed over the years. And the questions that I've had to ask of water and about water have changed over the years. And that's partly a reflection or a result of the contingent circumstances, you know, of my life, where I've found myself, the kind of work that I've done, the people that I've met, the stuff I've read. But it's also partly, I think, due to water itself. This stuff that it's stuff that really is hard to pin down and grasp in every way, and that keeps leading you on to all kinds of other worlds and realms and questions. So just my first book on water was back in the 90s, 1997. I wrote a book. I'm from Canada, and the book was titled Beneath the Surface: The State of Water in Canada. And that was I wrote that, it was published by the Canadian Wildlife Federation. So it was sort of an environmentalist approach to water. I didn't question the nature of water much. You know, it was not a critical kind of a study. I presumed that we knew what water was, the stuff that you read about in the dictionary. The dictionary definition of water is kind of what described it for me. I didn't put too much, didn't examine too much that question. My approach, I guess, would have been a realist approach, presuming that objective scientific methods could give us, you know, the definition of what water really is. And it's that kind of an approach that allows somebody to write a book with the title of The State of Water in Canada, unselfconsciously and fairly confidently, you know. Some 10 years later, I produced another thing on water. It was my PhD thesis. And in the meantime, I had gone to university and done a PhD in geography, where I was introduced to critical approaches, rooted in Marxism and mainly Foucauldian post-structuralism. And what that, at that time, it was in the early 2000s, in geography, there was a great deal of attention given to nature, to the idea of nature, and to how nature is socially constructed, the concept of nature, and sort of the critical dimensions of that being very importantly associated with the question about who gets to define nature, who has the power, if you like, to formalize a discourse about what nature is, because nature gets used, you know, as an argument to defend all kinds of social circumstances and relations and power hierarchies. When you think about it, it's a very powerful concept to be used that way. And so a critical approach to nature that I sort of took on from these critical readings based in Marxism and post-structuralism, I sort of turned towards water, I guess, sort of aimed at those kind of critical tools, if you like, towards water, having you know, thought about water for a long time and written on water. And that to me raised all kinds of questions about, you know, how different people in different places and different times think about water, and how that relates to what they do with it, and how it relates to social relations, and how the definition of what water is at any given time and place becomes hegemonic, and how that idea underlies and substantiates and comes to the aid of power structures that wherein some people win and some people lose. And the extent to which, therefore, water and the idea of water and the concept of water at any given time and place is really very intensely political. And that's, so to me, it brought forth the burning question, you know, what is water? And that's the, that I had published, that was basically my PhD thesis that I had published a couple of years later as a book. And following from those ideas, along with another colleague, Jessica Budds, we developed a concept that had sort of been out there a little bit, but we sort of fleshed it out as the hydrosocial cycle. That's basically a way of denaturalizing water and politicizing water, and saying that in every instance, water is what it is and becomes what it is within a social context. In every instance that we're familiar with, anyway, it becomes what it is within a social context that has political implications. So when you run water through the hydrosocial cycle, it's a way of politicizing it in every instance. So more recently, my main conceptual preoccupation, I suppose, has been with the concept of multiple waters and trying to understand how waters can be and are different. So, I mean, that follows from, obviously it follows from the previous work on sort of water as a social construction that gets constructed in different ways by different people at different times, how water, like nature, you know, is a culturally relative thing. But it's also based in other kinds of approaches. Gaston Bachelard famously talked about the variety of waters that was so universally celebrated by poets. Reading a lot of anthropology, of course, awakens one to the real, the depth of difference, I guess, in how people understand what water is in different places. Also, the history of water. I mean, one of the really interesting themes, big themes in the history of water that I take from an environmental historian named Hamlin, Bruce Hamlin, is Christopher Hamlin. I'm sorry. Is before sort of the modern era, when water gets water becomes known as a chemical compound of hydrogen and oxygen in the 18th century, Antoine Lavoisier and Cavendish and the whole gang. and therefore becomes something to which all the waters of the world hitherto known can be reduced. You know, all the waters were considered always to be different things. Waters in the plural were, you know, the old natural histories of water that you read talk about the variety of different waters, not only the imagination, but real material waters, different waters. The Romans, we know we always are big on how the Romans were so modern in the sense that they, you know, the ancient Rome was served by a volume of water per person that exceeded, you know, the wealthiest European cities in the 19th century. And we always think about that sort of in modern terms, but really interesting aspect of Roman water is that they maintained distinctive waters. Those aqueducts kept the waters from the separate sources in separate conduits. You know, there was a practical aspect to that because some waters were good for the, you know, the thermal baths, some waters were good for drinking, some waters were good for industrial purposes. But there was also sort of the recognition of an ontological difference between these waters. Hippocrates, you know, going back to the Greek, Hippocrates, airs, waters, and places, maintained the importance of recognizing the distinctiveness of different waters, and that they shouldn't be mixed. Anyway, so the history of water, the history of water has this as an important thing. But the other thing that really draws me to this question of multiple waters is my experience in Canada, having worked with First Nations people, Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, and how water for such people is really a very different thing than what it is for us modern folks. Water for Indigenous peoples, and this applies to Indigenous peoples not just in Canada, but in North America and Latin America, but Australia, New Zealand. Virtually all Indigenous peoples regard water as a being, a living being, which makes me think that it's really we, the modern European type thinkers, who are the exception, you know, in thinking that water is this dead substance, chemical compound, resource, whatever you want to, it's a dead substance. But what the question of multiple waters is compelling to me because I try to come to grips. I want to understand how people can think that water is a living thing. It's the typical of us modern Europeans to look at how other peoples in different places have regarded things and suggested, well, that's their way of seeing it. But ultimately the water is the same thing. It's ultimately a compound of hydrogen and oxygen. We all know that. They've got this funny interpretation of that compound and they call it a living thing or a spirit. And what I think, what I've tried to do is to take very seriously the claim that people have that water is a living thing and try to understand what it means. What is that difference? How do we understand that degree of difference? And this gets us into ontological questions. So when we talk about multiple waters, there is on one hand cultural relativism, different ways of interpreting, different standpoints, different perspectives on that same thing that we all understand to be H2O. And there's the question, there's also at the same time, so I feel like a deeper kind of difference we call ontological difference, which gets us into questions about the ontological turn. I've just been wrestling with that stuff, trying to understand it. And the way I do understand it is that, you know, as we all know from paying attention to water, things are not fixed, but they're always in a state of becoming. And the way I understand it is that they become as a function of the relations and circumstances. So I think for us, they become as a function of the methods that we use to know them. And so Indigenous peoples, for instance, treat water, they don't just think of water as a living thing, but they relate to water as a living thing. They converse with water. They offer offerings of tobacco to water. Water is a component. Water is another being within the social relations that they have. And if you engage in those kinds of practices with water, what I say is that it becomes that. So water becomes a living thing for people who engage in those kinds of relations with water. It becomes that way. Whereas if we think of and treat water as this dead inert substance, well, it becomes that for us, and it's becoming that everywhere. In terms of, we can see this in terms of water pollution and all kinds of water problems that we have. Finally, a current project I'm working on here at the University of Limoges that's not unrelated to the question of multiple waters. In English, would be called Developing an Education of Attention to Water. And this, I think this goes, I like Rupert said that his one reason for writing the book was to reawaken a sense of wonder in writing that book. And I think it certainly succeeds in doing that. One of the things with water, I think living in the modern city, we've killed water. We've killed it with the tap, we've killed it with the tap and with our abstract methods of knowing water. So we all know water actually really well. We've got tremendous abstract knowledge of water. We measure it. We know that the hydrological effects of climate change. And at the same time, we know it very well through the tap. But in a kind of a living sense, our understanding, our knowledge, our contact, our relations with water have been radically impoverished by the methods on one hand and the techniques on the other. Most of us live in a city. Our contact with water, if you like, our water environment is extremely limited to the tap, the shower, the toilet, the odd drop of rain, in between the house and the car on the way to the supermarket or something. We've buried all the rivers, the streams, in the cities. They're all underground now. The rivers in the cities, they're sort of decorative objects that we look at, but we've really lost contact with that and impoverished our relations in a way that was absolutely not the case for people even 100 years ago. So here where I live in the Limousin, it's obvious everywhere that people had a much closer relationship, a much more direct relationship, and a different kind of knowledge about water. It's obvious in the landscape where you see vestiges of what we might call small scale hydraulic works everywhere. This is even in a place where it rains a great deal. There's no shortage of water, but it was meticulously managed in a way that suggests that there was very widespread knowledge of and engagement with water in a way that's absolutely completely finished today. In toponymy, if you look at maps here, and if you talk to a person who's familiar with the Occitan language that was spoken here, not half, but a third of all the little place names in one way or another relate to water. There was not long ago a depth of relationship and a depth of awareness and knowledge related to water that's completely lost now. So in my teaching, I'm making efforts to, if you like, get back to the water, taking students out as much as possible, getting our feet wet, talking to old timers about traditional water practices, working with old tools, talking about drainage, talking about basic hydrological processes. So that's sort of the short version of what I've been doing. Let me just conclude by making a reference to our task, as I really like it, as Anna and colleagues have set out for us, namely how thinking with water can encourage alternative knowledge practices. And I mean, I just want to say, given the state of things or the direction of things, like it seems to me we need desperately a philosophy of change or flux or process. And we need a philosophy that allows us mainly to unstick ourselves, to get unstuck from ourselves, from our identities, from our ideas about what we need and what constitutes the good life, especially us in the developed, modern, rich world. We need a philosophy that allows us to unfix ourselves, to unmoor ourselves, and to dissolve the categories and some of the ideas that we've held for a long time. And with that, water is a really good thing to think with. So that's my little introduction. And I think, Rupert, we were going to ask each other a couple of questions to get a conversation going.
Oh, yeah, I think that's right. Oh, there we are. Yeah. So Jamie, I read your book as well. I really enjoyed it and I learned a lot. I really enjoyed the emphasis on the social and the political dimension of water, which is much more in evidence than in my book. Certainly, it was. I learned a lot from that, amongst other things. And I've got a few questions. So the first one is in the book. So I'm talking about your book, What is Water? You refer to relational dialectics, and you say dialectics provides a way of understanding the flow of history as well as the flow of water and reveals how these flows are very closely related. And that makes a lot of sense to me. But in fact, dialectics is itself a very fluid term. It's quite elusive in a way, and it implies not only process and flow and relationality, but it can imply sometimes yes, sometimes no, directionality. And I just wondered how much your concept of relational dialectics includes a direction, or whether we just get dragged along by water, or whether there is a space for volition, human volition in there, or perhaps we go around in circles as it's water.
Yeah. Thanks. There's definitely a space for human volition. So against Hegelian or Marxist dialectic, this notion of relational dialectics, as I understand it, is non-directional in that sense, So I get it from a geographer, David Harvey, is a Marxist geographer, but not just Harvey, but others. So if I was to really try and summarize this answer for the question of relational dialectics is really oversimplifying it to say. However, in a sense, relational dialectics is a way of understanding how everything is related. And thus, how there are multiple, since everything is related, there are multiple points of departure, points at which change can be made to occur. So in terms of the social process, change in the social world occurs as a result of all kinds of different things within a relational dialectical understanding of things. With water, for instance, a flood, the physical material, water, a flood can change things. Floods has changed political histories, but if we can change things as a result of discourse also, the way we talk about something, the way we understand something, it's not just an accident that, for instance, in the 1990s, there was this era of privatizations of water services all around the world. One of the most famous wars that took place in that period of time was at Cochabamba, Bolivia. And the slogan that the defenders of public water put forward at that time was "Water is life." Water is life. So this is another point of change, is discourse. The identity that you ascribe to something can have an effect in how it's its future. You can change things through technology, you can change things through social relations, you can change things through political power. So relational dialectics, I think, is a very optimistic way of understanding that change is not only possible, but it helps us sort of direct our energies towards making change happen.
And you do in your book, you lay quite a lot of emphasis on ideas as an almost material factor, isn't that right? So perhaps that's where we step in, humans step in, and we have to produce ideas, and that way we direct water.
Well, yeah, I mean, if ideas can motivate things, absolutely, yeah. At the same time, you know, this takes us to another question: where do the ideas come from?
Yeah,
you know, I'm with Gaston Bachelard and Lakoff and Johnson and the metaphors of things, and how you know we can't really think without we have a hard time thinking outside of our embodied experiences. The ideas we really. I think this idea appeals to me a lot, and in as much as so much of our bodily experience is tied up with water.
yeah.
Water really does influence the way we think and our ideas, at least the way we express them. So, and it's not a coincidence that we, you know, so many of our metaphors are water-based, right? But that's not to say that we cannot have ideas that change the world, and that's a good place to start.
You could say that it's water that's thinking.
Well, apparently, in as much as I don't know what proportion of the brain is made of water.
I think we get more shriveled as we grow old. It gets less.
Yeah. So yeah, so that's dialectics is I think that in relational dialectics is quite different from if you look at the dialectic that gives rise to a doctrine of historical materialism, for instance.
Okay, I've got another question. Shall I hit you with a question, or do you?
Go for it, sure.
Well, it's another really interesting thing that comes up in your book is, and you mentioned in when you're talking as well, is that you stress a lot the multiplicity, the multiple nature of water, as opposed to, and your book is a sort of critique of the attempt to homogenize and universalize water in the abstract. So there's very much a sense that, you know, there are many waters, not one. And the question is, given that, you know, we do all admit that there is something called H2O, how far can you go with that sort of ontological pluralism?
Right. But by that, do you mean how different can the waters be?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, for example, yeah.
Right. But as I mentioned, I come at that question so as to try and understand the nature of the quality of difference, so that I see among the First Nations people where I come from in Canada, to try and understand it. And so what I'd say is that I don't think anything is two things at once. I don't think you can have two things at once. So for me, the question isn't, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about water, the question is not what is. The ontological question, the valid question isn't what is. The valid ontological question is what's happening. What's happening? So, and to that, there are multiple possible answers, and the answer depends. The outcome of things depends, and the outcome of things depends on the kinds of relations, the circumstances that pertain. So that it is possible, if water is regarded as a living being, that it becomes a living being for those who regard it as such. We're weird in the sense that we don't regard it as a living being. And that might just be one of the reasons why it's in such a bad state, you know. I think that for when you regard you know, as with our family, as regard their friends, loved ones, other people, you can't treat people that you regard and relate to as a fellow being. You know, it constrains the way that you behave. There's certain rules apply, and certain rules, and so it's what's interesting to me is the becoming of things. So and how things and why they become the way they do. And that's the way that I understand ontological pluralism. You know, in the ontological turn, you know, this movement that swept the social sciences and humanities for some 15 or more years. Reality is not, reality is done. Reality becomes. It's a very much a process philosophy that's, you know, Alfred North Whitehead is a big figure in this way of thinking. So for me, it's not a magical thing where there's multiple worlds existing at the same time. The question is what's it becoming, and that's about as far as I'd take it.
Yeah.
There is the question of communication. Because normally when when you're communicating with other people, you have to use the same words. So the fact that we use a single word,
Right.
we have to do that in a way, and it can be. I mean, water's so confusing in that respect. So we've
Right.
got Roger Bacon in the 13th century referring to royal water, aqua regia, which is in fact a mixture of hydrochloric acid and nitric acid. And even today, you've got the aqua fortis the used in etching, which is strong water, but it's not. It's nitric acid, I think. So, but yeah, you do have to use the word,
Right.
yeah.
Well, there is something there, and it constrains what we can make of it. That's something. And defining it is tricky. I mean, I like Ivan Illich. Ivan Illich. Maybe some of you have read Ivan Illich, H2O and the Waters of Forgetfulness. So for Ivan Illich, water is the ineffable stuff to which our imagination gives form, right? So it's formless, ineffable stuff. Stuff is about as close as you can come to it, but it's undeniably there.
Yeah.
And it undeniably constrains what we can make of it and what our imagination can make of it.
So if you don't mind, I think it's probably a good idea now to open to questions. We have quite a few in the chat. I have some of my own, but I will let Camilla take over in moderating.
So we have a little discussion in the chat about how do we define a living being, which Jamie partially developed and answered, but maybe I would, Bénédicte, would you like to ask your question? Bénédicte Millon?
Yes, sure. Sorry, wait a second. I'm sorry, I've been sick, so my voice is totally broken. Here I am. Yeah, no, I was just, thank you very much for both these presentations, which I found were fascinating. And so this is also coming from somebody who's running a program on blue humanities and ecopoetics. And I'm hoping that a lot of people engaged in this conversation tonight and the Performing Water group, we can talk later about other things. But so the question I had was about Jamie. At some point you said water was considered by Indigenous people as a living being, which I think in itself is interesting, an expression which we all use because it's so tautological. I mean, a being, how do we define a being? And why do we say a living being? And what does it mean to be a being? Is it just that it is? And, you know, in that sense, maybe water is in any case, so could be considered a being. But then you also rephrased it and you said a living thing, where I was like, oh, now we went from a living being, which is tautological, to an oxymoron, because usually in our modern dualistic thinking, we oppose beings and things, right? And so I was wondering, what your thoughts are about this, and maybe I was just thinking it's the concepts that we're using, beings and things, separating the world into those two categories, that now we're also talking about animate matter, and that all matter is animate. So I don't know if you want to answer that question, please.
Right. Well, I guess I'd have to answer by saying that I was a bit sloppy in my vocabulary. I just trying to understand how water can be considered a living being. Let me use that. Because and what the point that I really want to make is the distinction between the way that we, and I say we Europeans, here we are in France, typically understand what water is, and to contrast it with the way that most indigenous people think about water. And a good example that's actually well known, these days, is the Wanganui River in New Zealand, which in 2017 was legally recognized as a person. So it's sort of a concrete example of a really, really different way of understanding what a river is, what water is, so I'm trying to understand how it is that people come to understand water as a living being, or in this case, a river as a living being. And as I say, the answer that I have come up with is that this is a matter of, literally, a matter of the kinds of relations that we have with this thing that may become a being within the context of a certain relational field.
Could I just add something, sort of coming at it from a different angle? I think the reason that we can think of rivers as living beings is that we effectively are sort of rivers. Humans are rivers in that we depend on a regular influx of water, and we also depend on being able to get rid of the water that we imbibe. And if you think about it, we have this influx of water, it goes into our body, and then it circulates around. So it's another sort of hydrologic cycle there, and then it goes out again. And without that flow of water, we're absolutely lost, So I think it was Novalis said, we are just basically molded rivers. That's what all, not just humans, or animals and plants and even fungi, all living beings are. So that's a different sort of answer. And I've been thinking recently about the concept of selfhood in terms of self-organization, and even something like a whirlpool is very much a self-organizing entity, similar to a human body in thermodynamic terms. So it requires an influx of energy, which is the sort of energy coming in with the river, and it gives off frictional energy. So there's a lot of analogies there between humans and rivers on a number of levels, really.
There's a question from Ramona, Professor Ramona Moos.
Hi, thank you, Rupert. Thank you, Jamie, for the wonderful conversation and your inputs. Hello. So because our seminars have really kind of read both of your works sort of side by side in really interesting ways, both the students in Berlin and I and the students in Le Mans, we were really struggling. And I think it's a question to both of you, first of all to Rupert, really. I was really struck by a sort of, while you were coming from very different kind of approaches, there's a sort of interesting overlap. So I'm kind of interested in like the role that myth plays in your in your work on water, in your conceptualization of water, and how you're kind of rethinking water and the sort of layering of all these different myths in the different chapters, and whether you feel that sort of resonates or links up in some way to what Jamie was saying about indigenous culture and a sort of alternative approach to water, because there I feel there's a sort of really interesting docking point of the two, and whether you can, can you speak to that a little bit? And then maybe secondly, before I stop, is the question of the sort of, I think, and this is to Jamie a little bit, like you were talking about, like that you are now working with students to really and kind of education of re-experiencing water, and how does that work in practice? You say you go and do stuff with water. Can you say more about that, like what these exercises look like? So that would be, I think, really interesting, and would also be really interesting for our students that are sort of also practically working with water and sort of making little performance works with water as well, in order to kind of practice that kind of reconceptualization of water and rethinking with water.
I'll answer the myth question first.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Ramona. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I hadn't really separated when I was writing the book. I was trying to, in a way, sort of integrate all different sorts of thought, sort of rather indiscriminately. So I wanted to not be separating poetic thought or mythological thought or scientific thought, but I was trying to, in a sense, find the bottom line, in a way, what they all have in common in their attempts to sort of capture water and contain it within some sort of concept. And I was also interested in a sort of universal point of view, in that myths, so many myths around the world are so similar, and religions as well. So for me, that was another aspect, all thrown into this pot. And I wanted to sort of, in a way, build bridges so that all these different sorts of thought would be thrown together and we'd see what came out, in a way. That would be my answer there. I wasn't specifically trying to focus on mythology, because I'm not an expert or anything like that, but I was interested in how it reflected things that other forms of discourse were also doing.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. And Jamie, do you want to say something about how hands-on you get with the water?
Sure. So, by the way, this is kind of inspired by, I don't know if you're familiar with the anthropologist Tim Ingold. Tim Ingold has come up with the term education of attention that he gets from an environmental psychologist named James Gibson. However, so concretely, this started last year. So we organized a couple of events, and bringing people, not just students, but people to in particular, spending a day together. And inviting people like who are experts in the Occitan language to do just as I described, to put up on project a map of the place that we are at and its surroundings, 10 kilometers around, and just simply to point out on the map all the places that were the toponym, the places that are named after water or water related features. And it's quite amazing, pretty astounding. We take students out big on field trips, taking students out, going for walks with people who, and still here in the limousine, you know, they're up until, you know, the 1960s, there was in the country here, there was no running water. In fact, the village where I live here, there's no running water before 1975. So going for walks with people who have a memory of doing clothes washing, lavoir, not just doing clothes washing, but how the water was channeled to the lavoir, who did that, who would wash the clothes, who channeled the water. Walks with people who remember there's a technology of very small scale water retention for thermal irrigation purposes here in the limousine, which allowed people to essentially grow hay 3 weeks before otherwise be able to do that, because you run small amounts of water on fields that would essentially melt the ice, the thin layer of ice on the surface, allowing that was hugely important for productive purposes. And that's all dead now. Nobody does that anymore. They just use big tractors and the industrially produced stuff. But there are still people who remember doing it. They go for walks with these people in the fields. Those people show us the little drainage ditches that they made, what's left of them, and it's pretty remarkable. Going for walks with people and using using the tools, the hand tools that were used to dig small drainage ditches. There's a thing called a tie pray that they used here to dig a drainage ditch. And we get we get a bunch of them, as many of these tie pray as we can, because there's still some of them around. And we give them to the students, and the students get out there and dig a little drainage ditch. Really an embodied thing about learning how water works, you know? And so it's that kind of thing, getting out and also I ask students, for instance, we go for walks we go for walks to a tourbière, peat bog, and some of them always forget to wear boots, despite that. And the challenge, you're literally getting their feet wet. And it's great fun because I ask them to write a little story about what they learned on their experience that they would not have learned by reading about going to a peat bog or reading about a peat bog or looking at something on their internet or something from it. What they learned from actually being there, sort of, you know, phenomenological approaches to this kind of thing. So it's ways of constructively getting out and doing field trips, and not just field trips to sort of identify species of plants or to count or, you know, water flow or something, but to be in place and what it means to be in a place.
Thank you. There is a whole discussion about navigation in the chat. So I would give the microphone to Carrie Noland. Carrie, would you like to ask a question?
Okay, I will ask it. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm trying to think of this book that I read a long time ago about, or maybe 10 years ago, about navigation, the kind of phenomenology of navigation. I can't remember or maybe someone does remember, but I am interested in the particular relationship to water that is developed by navigators. You know, both early navigators who could only read the water, read the stars, but also today, you know, people who do a lot of canoeing and other kinds of sailing, they have to be able to read the water. And it's not like swimming in the water or dancing in the water, because you're navigating requires a sense of all the relationships between the different elements. So I was wondering if you could speak to that and the history of navigation as a particular relationship that human beings have had to water.
Rupert, can you speak to that one?
I can have a go. That's another interesting question. What I know is just how sort of the unknowability of waters has two aspects. It's sort of traditionally it's been, I mean, even today it's vertical, so we're very we don't navigate downwards very much. So I think only one submersible has been as far as the Mariana Trench, sort of 10 kilometers down in the depths. And as far as traditionally, until sort of the discovery, well, until people worked out how to calculate longitude, navigation was just hit and miss. So sailors generally stayed close to the coast because it was so dangerous. Then the discovery, or the working out how to deal with longitude was one of the big challenges in the 17th and 18th centuries. And you know, I think calculating the longitude was something like squaring the circle. That was how it was regarded, and a public prize was put out and things like that. So that changed things. Before, people were very much oriented towards the stars and things like that, which makes it, you know, if it's cloudy, then you're not in a good position. Things did change with discovery of longitude, and we still have this navigation. For me, is also a question of downwards, and we are so ignorant because it, you know, as people often say, we know the moon better than we know the depths, and most of the biosphere is, you know, a massive proportion of the biosphere is down there, and we just haven't got a clue. We destroy it quite happily using benthic trawling and things like that. You're just trashing complete ecosystems without even seeing them, anything like that. We do that okay, but we don't actually navigate them because it's so expensive. And, you know, you have to have these submersibles, and down at 4 kilometers down in the ocean, you know, I think the pressure is equivalent to being underneath, like, the Empire State Building made of lead. That's how, so you get pretty flat if you were down there with outside your submersible. So and it's very dark as well. There's quite a few factors that make it difficult. So navigation downwards is very difficult. So I don't know whether that really answers your question, but it was just a couple of ideas that I had. Jamie.
Well, I have one thing. I'd like to know which book that is. That sounds like an interesting one. The only thing that I can speak to is the canoeing. That's something that we do a lot in Canada, and here in France too, of course. But I wonder, and you mentioned your sort of the metaphor of reading the water. I think I'd question that as a way of understanding what's going on, because in that case of canoeing, if you're canoeing in white water a little bit, you know, water, you're not reading anything off of the water. It's not signifying, you're not interpreting something. It's not a sign. There's no signifier there. It's being interpreted in some way. Rather, to me, it seems what's going on is you're engaged in a kind of dance with the river partner, and it's a different kind of a relation, a different kind of thing that's happening there. Just as when you're dancing with your partner, you're not reading your partner. You're engaged in together producing an embodied kind of an act, right? So interesting about what navigation is in that case.
Anna.
Okay, thank you. So I have a quick question for Rupert, and then I have sort of a longer question for both of you, if that's okay. So Rupert, in your book, one thing I just can't manage to really wrap my mind around is you conclude by saying that we are how water knows that it exists. Can you tease that out for me a little bit more, please?
Oh, no, I'm afraid not. Well, it's really based on the fact, on an interpretation of us as water, really, as watery beings. And if you think of the world, you know, as water, we are structured water, and it's through the structure that have structures that have evolved into us, that the watery universe sees itself or thinks about itself. I'm not really saying anything deeper than that, but perhaps not. That doesn't help. Does that?
Well, it might lead into my sort of longer question. So I wanted to ask both of you. So I mean, obviously, Jamie, you say over and over, water is what we make of it. So there's this integral polyvalence. And then Rupert, it seems like every time you give a positive example, you're quick to say, oh, but be careful, because the opposite is also true. So water is also extremely destructive, and also a place where life cannot happen for many reasons a lot of the times. And so in this undertaking of our project, I mean, I think we're kind of working, my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, but I was under the assumption that we're working with a sort of positive assumption that water is helpful, can be helpful as a sort of conceptual model for interactions. Is it really just purely a pharmacon and can be as equally helpful as equally destructive? Or can you hold out any hope there that there's, I don't know if it's a quantitative question or a qualitative question. Is there something eminently helpful in water in alternative thinking practices, for example?
Jamie, do you want to start, or shall I?
But I think it depends on the circumstance. I think for a lot of people who like, let me say, maybe I'm going out on a limb here, but if you're a conservative kind of thinker, and you want the categories, you appreciate the importance of maintaining the categories, respecting them, and not changing things too quickly. Maybe water isn't the best thing for you to think with. On the other hand, if as I said at the end of my little talk, if you find yourself in a time when you think it's important that we unstick ourselves from ideas that we've grown up with, from categories that have gone kind of stale, from ideas about what we need and who we are, then maybe water is really a good thing. So I think for me, the answer is it's relative.
I think that's right. I think, as you say, Anna, it is. I sort of think the idea of the pharmacon is sort of apposite. It's good and bad. It's not. It's what we make of it, but that makes it all the more important for us to do good things with it. So that that's more an incitement to do good things than any sort of resignation. We have to do the right things. I mean, just to give you an example of water sort of not being very nice to me, when I was writing my book, I had massive flooding in the flat where I lived. And I thought, oh no, what am I doing wrong? I've angered somebody. And it was just all my books, well, half of my books got soaked. And this morning when I was coming here, just before I left, I got an email from where my mum lives, that there's plumbing problems there as well. And I thought, oh, that's it again, so I'm going to leave my hands from water. I think there is something quite frightening about water. It's really frightening, and in the way that humans are frightening. If you think about, almost everything is frightening if you think about it the right or the wrong way, depending. So, but just I mean, what I wanted to do with the book was to make sure we do the right thing. And I think in my case, I think if you do have this sense of awe towards water or wonder, then it helps you do the right thing in some case. I mean, so Jamie talked about the indigenous people and their sense of wonder towards water, or their sense of communion. And I think although, I mean, I live in a city, so I'm an urbanite, but I like cities. I've always lived in cities, and cities are okay. It's what we've got. It's the only way we're going to survive on the planet. I believe, and that, you know, with the numbers of us that there are. So for me, a tap water is magical, and we have to go with that. And you know, chlorinated, some people say, oh, chlorinated water, that's, you know, it's sacrilege, but chlorinated water is actually a miracle. And we have to sort of say, wow, I can drink this and not die. And that's, there's things like that, you know, there's wonder to be found in really strange places, I think.
Could I just jump in, Anna, with a question that's a related question that I had wanted to ask of Rupert, and that is how, if all this thinking about water, how it, in reflecting on water, does it help us think about resolve water problems? You know, I want to say thinking, I mean thinking, you know, philosophically about water, these kinds of questions that we've been raising. How does that help us deal with what the real material and urgent water problems that are now being, you know, are obvious all over the place?
Well, I think it does, really. And I think something like your book, because it, to the extent that it opens you up to the perspective of people who are normally voiceless, or people who have a voice that is less heard in society, I think it helps. And I think, yeah, I think that there is a lot of space for, I mean, also your book is quite critical with sort of statist conceptions of water, you know, there's a lot. I think we can really get a long way by looking at things at a local level. I think there's also, we need a globalist perspective on water. I do think, you know, science as well is necessary. Science that is aware of its own limited status, say, you know, we have to know if there is arsenic in water or whatever, if we're going to drink it. But I do think that, you know, we do have to listen to all sorts of voices. That's the big thing. And but I think in general, an awareness of water helps in these respects. I would say so.
Okay, we maybe have we're going a little bit out of time, so we will maybe just have one last question from the chat. Please, Ruby Devoy, can you have the mic?
Sure. Hi. Thank you both so much. I've really enjoyed this. I just have a question about, I suppose, language in relation to constructing modern water, and also like this process that you talk about of relearning and re-educating ourselves in relationship to water. And I'm wondering how, for example, with these farmers that you interact with on the field trips that your class takes, do you notice a difference in the way that they talk about water and the way that water is referred to? And how do you see like the average person or the student trying to re-educate themselves about water as being like, how can we change the way we talk about water in order to change the way we think about water? If you could speak on that, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Right. First of all, I think it really is an interesting question, because one of the things that we're least aware of is the way that we talk. So I've noticed in France, and maybe others have noticed it too, but here very, very frequently, and I'd be interested to know if that's the case in Spain as well. When people talk about water, it's almost an automatic thing that we refer to les ressources en eau, les ressources en eau. We talk about water resources. We say this in English too all the time. Water resources is almost like a knee-jerk automatic thing. Water resources. It comes a time I came up, why we always refer to water in these resource terms, and certainly that, I think it's really an interesting point, because it structures a way of relating to water, right? A water resource is there's automatically sort of an instrumentalist approach towards that stuff. that defines, it constrains, it contextualizes the kind of relationship that you're going to have with the water, and it's something that comes up all the time here. And what's interesting is that you asked about the farmers. It's funny, and I hadn't thought of it, but I think the interesting thing is that they don't talk about water that much. They don't talk about water, and that's what's interesting. They talk about, all the other things that are related to it, I suppose, and the people and the activities that make it available or not, distributed or not, and what it's used for, what it might be used for. But I'm not sure that they talk a lot about water. We do. We tend to talk a lot about water. Water is the thing, and I think that, to me, it sort of reflects an approach that we have towards things, where we sort of fetishize things and we're sort of somewhat blind to the relations that make them what they are and make them available. But that's an interesting question. I don't know, Rupert, in your experience and the way people talk about water, is there something there that?
Well, I don't know about scientific, in scientific terms in water. I don't know. I imagine it's the same. I imagine it's as you describe it, an emphasis on the resource. In general terms, in Saragossa, there is it is a city. It's quite a big city. They're quite good at water awareness. In general terms, they did have in 2008 they had an international exposition which was all around water, and they were very proud of that, and quite rightly in a way. I thought they made a good job of it, and so it wasn't a universal exposition like the massive ones at Seville or the other places where there's massive universal exposition. This was just an international one, so a medium-sized one, but it still lasted for 3 months. And there was a lot of education. School trips went to the exposition to learn about water, and each country had its own pavilion. It was a good thing, and there was, it was people re-educating themselves en masse in a way, and voluntarily as well, because it was a lot of civic pride. I'm not sure how much that's changed things since. I mean, you go back to the site of the expo and it's a bit of a mess now. So it's with a lot of these things, there were vested interests and economic interests, but I don't want to be too cynical. At its time, it was really good, and so I was quite proud of my adopted city there.
Thank you. I'm horribly sorry. We are really out of time. I would like to apologize to Teresa. She had a very interesting question about embodiment. To Anne-Laure Fortin-Tournès, she had a question about neutrality of water, but I sincerely invite you to continue the conversation, beyond the seminar online, by mail, and in the chat.
Let's give a big virtual round of applause to our two speakers. Yes, it was an absolute delight. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Again, Rupert and Jamie, that was really exciting and fascinating. It's so wonderful to put faces to all the text that we've been reading. So this was great.
Okay, so thank you to everyone, and see you next time.